Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Today, we'll take a look into the complex and painful past of the Dursley family. We'll explore why Petunia Evans turned away from her sister, what truly lies behind their hostility toward Harry Potter, and what secret Petunia took to her grave. You'll hear unspoken words, hidden dreams, and the bitterness of what was lost. Enjoy the video. Number 1. Petunia's hidden dream. Few people know this, but in her youth, Petunia Evans dreamed of the same thing as her sister. She wanted to go to Hogwarts. In an interview, J.K. Rowling revealed that Petunia even wrote a letter to the headmaster asking to be accepted, but of course, she had no magic. It was her first deep disappointment. Her sister was a witch, the favorite of their parents, and she was just normal. It was from this sense of injustice that her coldness was born. She didn't hate Lily, she envied her. And she hated herself even more for that envy. Number 2, Petunia's grudge and the rift with her sister. When Lily received her Hogwarts letter, everything changed in the Evans household. The parents were thrilled to have a daughter who was a witch. Petunia, on the other hand, felt forgotten. It wasn't just jealousy, it was a silent cry for attention that no one ever heard. From Severus Snape's memories, we see how deeply Petunia was hurt by it all. She couldn't forgive Lily not for leaving for the magical world, but for making her feel abandoned, even by her own family. That was when Petunia decided to leave her home, her town, her past. Number 3. Meeting Vernon and the beginning of a normal life. In London, Petunia found refuge in routine, office work, lunch at cafes, conversations about coupons and petrol. All of it was like a suit of armor, and it was there she met Vernon Dursley, pragmatic, stubborn, and completely detached from magic and wonder. He became her symbol of stability. When he learned about Lily, Vernon simply waved it off. So she's a witch. You're the normal one. That was exactly what Petunia wanted to hear. With him, she could build a life with no magic, no secrets, no pain. Number 4. The ill-fated dinner, meeting Lily and James. But the past caught up with her. Trying to mend their relationship, Lily invited her sister and fiancé to dinner. It was a disaster in the making. Vernon skeptically asked James what kind of car he drove, and James jokingly replied, "I've got a racing broom." Vernon took it as mockery and remarked that wizards probably lived off welfare. James fired back, proudly referencing the gold in his Gringotts vault. The air grew tense and heavy. Vernon stood up and took Petunia away. After that, she didn't invite Lily to her wedding and never tried to reconcile again. Number 5. A life without magic and the torn letter. Petunia got what she thought she wanted: a house, a husband, a son, neat lawns, and no magic. The last bridge to her past was a letter announcing Harry's birth. She tore it up without finishing it and threw it away. It was a symbolic act. She was erasing Lily from her life. From that moment, Petunia stopped speaking about her sister. Even her name became taboo. Number 6. Harry in the Dursley household. But fate had other plans. After Lily and James's death, Harry ended up on her doorstep. Petunia reluctantly took in her nephew, not out of love, but out of duty. Vernon, recognizing traces of James in the boy, disliked him immediately. And Petunia, seeing Lily's eyes, was daily reminded of the soul she once rejected. Her harshness toward Harry wasn't cruelty. It was pain. He was a living reminder of the past she had tried so hard to erase. Number 7. Farewell to Harry, a moment of truth. Their farewell scene in the 7th book is one of the most powerful. Many expected that finally she would say something kind. But Petunia remained restrained. Yet in that moment, when she looked into Harry's eyes, it was as if, just for a second, she saw Lily again. And it touched her, even if she said nothing. Rowling later explained, Petunia simply doesn't know how to express emotion. but her silence spoke louder than any words. Number 8. Secret correspondence with Dumbledore. One cold morning when Harry was 5, Petunia sat at the kitchen table, trembling. Vernon had left for work. Dudley was still asleep. And Harry had just accidentally made a plate float across the room. That was the moment she broke. She pulled out old stationery, addressed it to Albus Dumbledore, Hogwarts, and wrote in tight, furious lines, "Take him. I cannot do this anymore. He's not mine. He belongs to your world. Send someone. Take him back." She sealed the envelope, handed it to a confused postman, and waited. The reply came not by owl, but in a quiet blue envelope left on her doorstep. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. Dumbledore's handwriting was elegant, but stern. "You accepted him into your home. In doing so, you saved his life. While he lives under your roof, he carries the protection of your blood, stronger than any spell I can cast." Petunia read those lines again and again. She didn't cry, but something inside her shifted. For all the anger she carried toward Lily, she was now the only barrier between her sister's son and a world still hunting him. She never wrote again, and though the resentment remained, she never tried to send Harry away after that, because now she understood. She was the spell. Number 9. Why Vernon feared magic. Long before he met Petunia, young Vernon Dursley had a cousin named Alfred, a strange boy, quiet, always watching and always changing. At one family gathering, Alfred grew furious when another child mocked his odd clothes. A second later, the curtains behind him burst into flames. No one saw matches, no one saw a lighter, just heat and panic. But the moment Vernon truly understood came when Alfred glared at him across the dinner table. Vernon blinked, and his eyebrows were gone. Not singed, not trimmed, gone. His parents rushed him to the bathroom, whispering that it had to be a trick. "We don't talk about that," his mother snapped. "Ever." That night Vernon sat in bed, staring into the mirror with a bald patch where his eyebrows should have been. He didn't sleep. He didn't speak to Alfred again. Years later, when Petunia explained that her sister was a witch, Vernon's reaction wasn't just anger. It was panic. "There's no such thing as magic," he barked, in Philosopher's Stone, louder than necessary. But inside he knew better. He had seen it, felt it, been changed by it. And he had spent every day since building a life of routine, numbers, polished shoes, and matching ties. Because in that world, things didn't disappear. Not even eyebrows. Number 10. Dudley and his hidden jealousy. Dudley Dursley never admitted it out loud, but even as a boy, he noticed something strange in the way his parents looked at Harry. There was fear, obsession, a constant panicked attention, even if it came in the form of locked cupboards and shouted orders. Harry was always the center of something. Dudley, spoiled and adored, still felt it. "They're always watching him," he once muttered to a schoolmate. "Like he's dangerous or important." Deep down, Dudley resented it. Not the beatings Harry took, but the mystery around him, the power, the sense that somehow his cousin didn't belong to their world, and that maybe Dudley was the one who didn't understand it. Years later, after the Dementor attack in Order of the Phoenix, something broke. Dudley stood trembling, terrified by the emptiness he had felt in the alley. And it was Harry, the cousin he used to chase through the garden with fists, who had defended him. That night, Dudley didn't say much, just a quiet, "I don't think you're a waste of space," before they parted ways. But months later, in a clumsy conversation with a friend, he confessed, "I hated that he could do magic. I hated that he wasn't afraid like I was. And I think I wished I was him." The jealousy, buried under years of laughter and shoves, had always been there. And only then did Dudley realize that Harry hadn't just survived his childhood. He'd carried them all through it. Number 11, the unspoken connection between Petunia and Snape. It was a quiet summer evening when Petunia found Severus Snape standing by the back fence, scuffing the dirt with his worn shoe. He wasn't there for her. He was waiting for Lily. But Petunia, curious and a little jealous, approached him. To her surprise, Severus didn't turn away. Instead, they talked. Not about magic, not about wands or spells, but about fear. "If I don't get in," he said, eyes dark and honest, "Lily won't want to be around me anymore." Petunia didn't reply. She only nodded. For a moment, they weren't a witch and a muggle. Just two lonely children, afraid of being left behind. But the letter came, and with it, the end of something that never had the chance to begin. Lily and Severus left for a world Petunia couldn't follow. She watched them from the gate, laughing with excitement, dragging trunks and dreams behind them. And that night, Petunia made a decision. No more witches, no more magic, no more hoping to be accepted. She built a wall, quiet but unshakable, around her heart. Severus never spoke to her again, but she never forgot that moment by the fence when even the boy who became a Death Eater once feared not being magical enough. Number 12. Petunia's secret visit to Godric's Hollow. It was winter, the kind of grey, biting cold that matched the silence in her chest. Petunia Dursley stood alone on a narrow street in Godric's Hollow, wrapped in a thick coat that couldn't protect her from the past. The gate to the Potter's ruined home was still there, twisted and blackened. Behind it, crumbling walls and an empty window stared back. The sign that hovered in the air, the one Harry had seen years later, shimmered faintly in the mist. Petunia didn't touch it. She didn't move. She only looked. And for the first time in decades, she let herself remember. She hadn't cried at Lily's funeral. She hadn't cried when the ministry owl brought the death notice. But here, in the quiet where her sister had died, the tears came like a storm. "Forgive me, Lily," she whispered, her voice dry, her fingers gripping the iron gate. The wind carried the name away, but the weight of it stayed in her chest. She remembered Lily's laugh, the way she twirled in their childhood garden with leaves in her hair, the letters, the last hug they never shared. There was no one watching, no Vernon, no Dudley, no Harry. Just a woman mourning what she had spent years pretending didn't matter. When she returned to Privet Drive, she didn't tell anyone, not a word. She made tea, folded laundry, asked Vernon about the weather, but something inside her had shifted. The coldness in her voice softened, if only slightly. She never went back to Godric's Hollow, but she kept a pressed wildflower from the roadside in her old purse, hidden behind a packet of tissues and a shopping list. Just one small thing to remind her that once, long ago, there were two sisters who had loved each other, even if neither ever truly knew how to say it. Number 13, Petunia's final gift to Harry. The guests had gone. Only flickering candles and half-empty glasses remained on the tables outside the burrow. Harry sat alone for a moment, letting the hum of the evening settle. That's when he saw it. A small envelope placed neatly beside his seat. No name, no seal. Just aged parchment and a strange stillness about it. He opened it, slowly. Inside was a photograph, its edges curled with time. Two girls, Lily and Petunia, standing barefoot in a garden, grinning with identical freckles. Their arms were wrapped around each other like it was the most natural thing in the world. On the back, written in firm but nervous script, "May you have what we never did." He stared at it for a long time. It couldn't have come from anyone else. No one else had access to that photo. He had never seen it before, and yet he felt like he had known it his whole life. The way Lily tilted her head, the way Petunia smiled before the bitterness set in. It was a frozen second from a life that could have been. A life before resentment, before jealousy, before the letters, the owls, the walls. Harry thought back to Petunia's silence when he left Privet Drive. The way her lips had trembled, like they wanted to say something, but couldn't. Maybe this was it. The thing she couldn't say, a final attempt at peace from someone who had no words left to offer. He never told Ginny about the photo. He simply placed it in the top drawer of his desk at home, right next to a box of chocolate frog cards and a broken snitch. And every now and then, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, he'd take it out and look at the two girls who once shared a garden. One who gave him life, and the other who tried, in her own quiet, awkward way, to return a piece of it back. Number 14, Petunia's fear of owls. The first time a letter from Hogwarts arrived for Petunia Evans, it didn't come quietly. A large tawny owl crashed through the open kitchen window, shattering a delicate porcelain vase that had once belonged to her grandmother. The vase was her mother's most cherished possession, and when it hit the floor, so did Petunia's sense of safety. Her parents, already enchanted by Lily's strange new world, scolded Petunia harshly. "You should have warned us if your sister was sending one of those things," her father snapped. To them, it was just another chaotic moment caused by magic. But to Petunia, it felt like betrayal. That bird hadn't just delivered a letter. It had destroyed a piece of her ordinary, fragile world. From that day on, Petunia flinched at the sound of wings. Every owl reminded her of that moment, of the sharp crash, the rising tears, and her mother picking up the shattered pieces while murmuring Lily's name with soft affection. It wasn't just about the noise or the feathers. For Petunia, owls were symbols of everything that had gone wrong. They represented a force she couldn't control, wild, proud, and utterly indifferent to her carefully built walls. Years later, when Hogwarts letters began arriving for Harry, Petunia saw them not as invitations but as invaders. She muttered to Vernon, "They'll break everything just like last time." Even in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, when the owls begin to arrive in waves, Petunia reacts with rising panic. "No post on Sundays," Vernon insists. "No damn letters today." But Petunia doesn't speak. She rips, burns, and boils every envelope that appears, and not out of logic, but fear. The sight of those birds circling their house like predators was enough to send her into a frenzy. To her, this wasn't correspondence. It was a siege. Her hatred for magic was rarely loud, but her fear of owls was different. It was visible, raw. She didn't just dislike magic, she feared its entrance, and the owl had always been its first messenger. The sound of wings against glass, the flutter of parchment landing on the floor. These were the sounds of a world she had been excluded from, punished by, and never truly escaped. Number 15, Petunia's one and only letter to Hogwarts. Before Lily Evans had ever received her letter from Hogwarts, before her name was penned in emerald ink on fine parchment, her older sister Petunia had already dreamed of the same magic. In the quiet corners of their childhood home in Cokeworth, while Lily was still chasing dragonflies and making flower petals dance, Petunia had been watching, listening, and aching in secret. Because long before she called her sister a freak in a voice hardened by disdain, Petunia Evans had tried, in her own desperate way, to become part of that glittering world herself. The letter was written in pencil because Petunia didn't own a quill. She didn't know that ink should be dark and permanent, or that her handwriting would be judged by centuries-old standards. But she tried. In the dim glow of her bedroom lamp, she folded the paper 3 times, placed it in a plain white envelope, and addressed it carefully. Admissions Office, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Scotland. She didn't know if that would be enough, but she hoped. In the letter, she poured her soul. She told them she had a sister who was special, that she'd seen impossible things. Petals turning into butterflies, water dancing mid-air, toys floating. She admitted she wasn't like Lily, but maybe, just maybe, she could become like her. "I just want to understand," she wrote. "And if I can't become magical, could someone explain why? Could someone tell me what makes Lily different?" She waited weeks for an answer. Each morning, before her parents or Lily were awake, Petunia would hurry to the postbox and check it with trembling hands. The neighbours thought she had joined a pen pal club. The truth was far more heartbreaking. On the 23rd day, a strange envelope finally arrived. It was thick and stiff, with a texture she'd never felt before. Her name was spelled correctly. She touched the ink for a long time before opening it. There was no crest, no gold, no invitation. It was a single page, typewritten, signed at the bottom by one Professor Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Petunia read the words slowly, her breath catching on every line. "Miss Evans, we thank you for your letter. However, we must inform you that you do not meet the criteria for magical instruction. The Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry admits only those who possess inherent magical potential. This potential cannot be taught, transferred, or acquired through desire. We appreciate your interest in the school and wish you the best in your future education." There was no warmth, no kindness. It was a letter that may as well have said, "You will never be one of us." She never showed it to anyone. She burned the letter the same night in a metal tin she kept under her bed, watching as the edges curled and blackened. The smoke made her eyes sting, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. Petunia hadn't just been rejected from a school. She'd been told by an institution that had taken her sister away from her that she would always be ordinary, that no matter how hard she watched, hoped, or tried, she could never understand. What followed was not anger, not at first. It was shame, a deep, gnawing humiliation that grew into something colder, something brittle. She pretended it had never happened. She told herself magic was foolish, childish, that her sister was a freak, and that freaks didn't belong in the real world. But in truth, every cruel word she ever said to Lily was a blade turned inward. She envied her, not for her powers, but for being chosen, for being seen, for being called special, when Petunia herself had begged for the same and been turned away. Years later, when Lily finally received her own Hogwarts letter, Petunia feigned surprise. She clapped politely when her parents showed off the parchment and owl feather, but her heart cracked again. There was a moment when she almost confessed it, told Lily that she too had once wanted to go, that she had written to the same school, that she had been rejected. But the shame was too old by then, too hard. So instead she began to pull away. Her smiles grew thinner. Her words became sharper. She started using phrases like "your sort" and "that lot." She began to forge a version of herself who didn't care about magic, who found it vulgar, even dangerous. Even Vernon Dursley, the man she would eventually marry, never heard about the letter. He only knew that Petunia hated anything abnormal. He never asked why. In truth, Petunia had chosen him precisely because he didn't believe in anything strange. With Vernon, she could control the narrative. She could bury the past under roast dinners and talk about drills. She could pretend she had never believed in any of it, that she had never cared. But the pain resurfaced in subtle ways. The way she sneered at Harry when he first arrived at number 4, the disgust in her voice when she mentioned Hogwarts, the horror in her eyes when owls came to deliver letters addressed to the cupboard under the stairs. It wasn't just fear of magic. It was fear of being reminded that she had once hoped for it too. That once, long ago, she had dreamed of receiving those very letters. She had dreamed of flying on brooms, learning spells, making friends in enchanted corridors. And when that dream died, she buried it so deep that even she forgot the exact shape of it. Number 16, when magic crashed their wedding. Petunia Evans had grown used to silence, not the silence of an empty room, but a kind that settled between two people once bound by childhood, now separated by the sharp blade of difference, of magic. On the morning she was to meet Vernon's family for brunch at their favourite country club, Petunia received a letter she would never forget. It wasn't addressed to her, not precisely. It came to the neighbourhood's general post box, a mishandled envelope marked with deep green ink. The handwriting was unmistakable. To Petunia, it was the past, unwelcome and fragrant, with something she had sworn to leave behind: Lily. The envelope bore the crest of Hogwarts, a mistake, clearly. It wasn't for her, and yet there it was, an invitation to attend a special event at the school for magical youth, an alumni reunion, it said, for those who graduated in 1978. That was Lily's year. That was also the year Petunia had given up trying to understand her sister. The timing could not have been more cruel, 3 weeks before her wedding to Vernon Dursley. She should have tossed it into the bin. She should have pretended it never arrived. Instead, Petunia hesitated. Vernon found the letter on the kitchen counter later that evening. He had returned early from work, eager to finalize the details for their honeymoon to Mallorca. But instead of finding dinner or a cheerful fiancé, he found an envelope. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, it read. The sound of his breathing changed, his lips pressed into a line. That school, that word. He hadn't heard it since Petunia told him about her sister during their 4th date at Hyde Park. He had laughed then, thinking it a harmless eccentricity. Later, the laughter turned to irritation, and now it turned to anger. There was no use denying what he thought. Petunia could see it in his eyes. You told me you were done with that world. His voice had not risen, but it trembled with contained fury. She tried to explain it away, saying it must have been a postal error meant for someone else. But Vernon Dursley, a man of order and clarity, didn't believe in postal errors, especially not from magical institutions. For him there were no coincidences. The appearance of that envelope in their home was a betrayal. The days leading up to the wedding became a terrain of tension. Petunia walked on eggshells, and Vernon grew colder. They proceeded with the preparations, flowers, menus, guest lists, but the warmth was gone. Vernon no longer reached for her hand under the table. He no longer whispered about their future in that flat they would soon share. The magic she had tried so desperately to shut out had found a way back in, and this time it had come disguised as a mistake. Petunia had thought she could bury it, that once Lily was gone from her life, once the letters stopped, once the owl no longer perched on their window during the summer holidays, she would finally feel normal. But the truth was, normalcy had always been a costume. Beneath the sensible dresses and polite smiles, Petunia carried a wound named jealousy, one that bled whenever someone mentioned Lily's brilliance, her place in a world Petunia had been denied. In the final days before the ceremony, Petunia did something she had sworn never to do again. She opened the cedar box hidden in the bottom drawer of her old vanity, a box she hadn't touched since Lily's last letter, since that Christmas before James Potter became more than just a name in Lily's giggles. Inside was a mirror, small, round, with an enamel backing. Lily had given it to her when they were girls. "If you ever miss me, just look into it," Lily had said. "I'll be looking too." A child's promise, stitched with magic, neither of them understood at the time. Petunia had wanted to throw it out many times, yet it had followed her, through university, through jobs, through apartments, and now into Vernon's home. She wrapped it in a linen handkerchief and placed it in her wedding clutch. It didn't match anything she was wearing. It didn't belong. But it was a tether to something that still ached inside her. On her wedding day, with a veil over her face and a ring on her finger, she would carry it like a secret. The wedding was a grand affair, Vernon's parents were proud, conservative people, and the guest list reflected their tastes: accountants, business partners, relatives with respectable surnames. No one from Petunia's side came, except her Uncle Algy, who mistook the fish forks for dessert spoons and made off-colour jokes about socialism. Lily was not there. She hadn't been invited, not because of some feud, at least that's what Petunia told herself, but because Petunia couldn't risk it. She feared what Lily's presence might do to the illusion she had built. She feared the stir her sister would cause with her wild hair and unashamed grace. But someone from that world was there. During the reception, Petunia felt a strange flutter near the cake table, a light flicker like heat over pavement. She turned, but saw nothing. She told herself it was just nerves, but when the band struck the first note of their first dance, Petunia's clutch trembled against her hip. She rushed to the powder room and opened the clasp. The mirror glowed faintly, not with reflected light, but from within. A heartbeat later, it dimmed. Number 17, the ban on saying Lily at home. There was a silence in number 4, Privet Drive, that went beyond the ordinary hush of suburban life. It was a silence sharpened by fear, polished by shame, and maintained with the kind of discipline that only grief can teach. It wasn't the absence of sound that made it unsettling, but the absence of something else, of someone else. Her name had once echoed in the walls of that house, if only faintly, if only from the cracked lips of a teenage Petunia Evans. But after Dudley was born and after that fateful Halloween night in 1981, the name Lily was cut out of the Dursley household with the same precision as a surgeon removing something diseased. Petunia Dursley never explained it formally, never made a dramatic declaration, never issued orders like a tyrant. But her house, her rules. There were no pictures, no letters, no dusty boxes in the attic, no old toys, no framed childhood portraits from Cokeworth. The bedroom Harry grew up in was bare of any memory, any hint that he had come from somewhere, from someone. And the very idea that his mother had existed at all, well, that was just as unmentionable as magic itself. It wasn't immediate. In the first days after Harry was left on their doorstep, swaddled and marked, Petunia had hovered by the window more than usual, hands clenched around the edge of the lace curtain. Her lips trembled at night when she thought no one was looking. And in the early morning, as Vernon snored and Dudley fussed, she would stand in the kitchen making tea, with her back to the world. Once, Harry found a crumpled photograph in the bin. A young girl with auburn hair laughing at a flower that danced above her palm. Petunia had torn it in half and thrown it away, but not before he saw the edge of magic. It was Dudley's birth that solidified the law. Something about holding her own baby boy, warm and pink and screaming with healthy lungs, made the weight of her sister's absence unbearable. She imagined perhaps Lily doing the same once, holding Harry, smiling at him, whispering lullabies, and then nothing, dust, rubble, a killing curse. Petunia had spent so long envying her sister, but now all that was left was pity and fear and guilt. That's when the decision was made. No more Lily, no more reminders. The pain had to be boxed up like Harry himself, and locked away forever. Vernon didn't argue. He didn't particularly care about the name. A name's just a name, he would say with a shrug. But even he wasn't foolish enough to challenge the cold gleam in his wife's eyes when she passed Harry in the hall. He had married Petunia, knowing there were things buried in her past, secrets like old bones. And if not mentioning a name helped maintain the order of their lives, so be it. He never used the name himself. Not once in front of the boy. Not even when Harry asked who his mother had been. Harry wasn't stupid. Children can sense when something is missing, even if they don't know what. He would sit on the swing in the park and watch other children run to mothers who kissed them, and he would wonder. He would glance around the Dursley living room and see no family but one, Vernon, Petunia, Dudley, and himself, the unwanted extra. He asked once, just once. A quiet moment in the kitchen, Petunia slicing carrots. He had waited until Dudley was in the lounge and Vernon was at work. He asked why no one ever talked about his mother. Petunia didn't scream. She didn't slam down the knife or push him from the room. She just paused. Her hand hovered over the half-cut carrot. Her shoulders tensed. And then she said something that Harry would remember for the rest of his life. Because speaking is more painful than silence. She didn't elaborate. She didn't look at him. But those words carved themselves into the back of his mind. At the time, he didn't understand. He was too young, too isolated, too hungry for affection, for answers. But later, after he'd seen her tears when she thought he was asleep, after he'd found another photograph buried in the lining of her old purse, he began to see. Petunia's silence wasn't born from hate alone. It was stitched together with grief. There's something uniquely cruel in loving someone you were raised to resent. Petunia had always been the plain one, the ordinary one, the one who could never make flowers bloom or call deer from the woods. She'd written to Dumbledore once, begging for a place at Hogwarts. She was refused. She watched her younger sister disappear into a world she could never join, and even worse, be praised for it. She had lost Lily long before that Halloween night, and yet, when the news came, the girl she had envied, despised, and once loved, dead in a ruined house, something in her cracked permanently. It was easier to pretend Lily had never existed than to face what had been lost. Easier to erase her from family history, to raise Dudley without her name ever passing anyone's lips. It wasn't just Lily who was forbidden, it was James too. It was the entire Potter name. Harry was only ever the boy, or him, or that one. When neighbours asked where he came from, Petunia smiled tightly and said, "Family troubles. We don't like to talk about it." And the neighbours, full of their own polite secrets, never asked again. Number 18, Petunia's fear of Dumbledore. When Petunia Dursley opened the door of number 4, Privet Drive on that cold November morning in 1981, the sight that greeted her did not merely surprise her. It stopped her breath. There, wrapped in a blanket, lay the baby she had vowed never to speak of again. But more than that, beside the child, lay a letter heavy with the weight of a past she had buried. And though he had long since vanished into the morning mist, she knew who had delivered it. Albus Dumbledore. The same man who, years earlier, had answered her desperate, trembling letter with cold finality. She had never seen him in person. But in that moment she felt as though he had been watching her all her life. Petunia had written the letter when she was barely 11. She never told her parents, and certainly not Lily. She had found the school name in one of Lily's careless scribbles buried in the folds of an old parchment. Hogwarts. The name had sounded ancient, secretive, full of promise. She had copied it down and added headmaster, not even knowing if that was the correct title, but she had poured her heart into that page. She had written about how she loved magic, how she wanted to be part of her sister's world, how she hated being ordinary. She signed it in cursive, Petunia Evans. Weeks passed. She had almost given up hope, believing the letter had been lost or ignored when the owl arrived. A magnificent creature, proud and foreign to her windowsill. It bore a sealed letter with her name on it. She opened it with trembling fingers, and there it was, not an acceptance, not even sympathy, just a short, formal rejection, penned in elegant handwriting that managed to sound kind and cruel at once. "I regret to inform you, Miss Evans, that Hogwarts accepts only those born with magical ability." It was signed Albus Dumbledore. She had never forgotten that letter. She burned it in the fireplace that same evening, watching the parchment curl into ash. But the words had etched themselves into her bones. From that day on, she promised herself she would not care. She would not long for magic. She would marry a man with a solid job and a normal car and a lawn trimmed to perfection. And she would never, ever speak of that school again. But when Dumbledore left Harry on her doorstep, Petunia felt as if he had walked straight out of her childhood shame and into her living room. He had not needed to knock or speak. His presence was like a shadow, stretching across decades, dragging back the girl who had begged to belong. And she knew then that he had never forgotten her, that this letter, too, was a response. She took the baby in, but she did not do so out of love or duty. She did it because Dumbledore had asked, or rather, because Dumbledore had expected. There was power in that expectation, the same power that had sliced through her years ago with the rejection letter. It was not a request. It was a summons. And Petunia feared what might happen if she refused. She read the new letter in the privacy of her kitchen, hands shaking, eyes scanning for anything that might hint at threat or command. But it was polite, even gentle. Dumbledore explained that her sister and James had died, that Voldemort had tried to kill their son and failed. He explained the protective charm that would shelter Harry only if he lived with Lily's blood. With her, Petunia Evans Dursley, she knew magic enough to understand what that meant, a spell rooted in blood, in ancient power. And Dumbledore was asking her to play a part in it. No, insisting. What frightened her most was not the magic, nor even the boy. It was Dumbledore's knowledge. The way his words, though few, seemed to know everything. He never mentioned the letter she had sent as a child, never alluded to her jealousy or shame. But his silence was louder than confession. She could almost feel his eyes behind the ink, watching her, remembering. He had not forgotten, and he knew she had not either. Petunia's fear of Dumbledore was not born of his power. It was born of her own exposure. He had seen through her once, and she believed he could do so again. That he knew how she had lied to herself for years, how she had dismissed Lily not because she hated her, but because she had wanted so desperately to be her. And now she was being pulled into the world she had rejected by the very man who had once kept her out. Over the years, she never spoke Dumbledore's name aloud, not to Vernon, not to Dudley, and certainly not to Harry. She trained herself to roll her eyes whenever Harry mentioned that headmaster. She scoffed at the idea of writing him when Harry received his letter at 11. But deep down, her heart clenched every time the name was spoken. She remembered that feeling of being weighed and found lacking, and she feared that someday he might appear again. When Hagrid arrived to deliver Harry's Hogwarts letter in person, Petunia's composure cracked. She unleashed years of bitterness in a single outburst. "You knew! You knew about the letters and the spells!" she shouted, her voice thick with emotion. "I was the only one who saw her for what she was, a freak." But the venom in her words was aimed not at Lily, but at herself. She was confessing, in the only way she knew how, that she had once wanted to be the same. Dumbledore appeared once more in her life in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. This time he entered her living room. He stood tall and calm, filling the air with quiet command. "We have corresponded, of course," he said, nodding at Petunia. She froze. She had hoped no one would remember. But Dumbledore never forgot. "Do remember me to your sister?" he had written so many years ago. And then again, he had entrusted her with a child and a spell. Now he had returned, not to ask, but to remind. Petunia felt a chill when Dumbledore mentioned the terms of the protection. As long as he can call this place home, while he is here, he will be safe. The weight of that truth pressed down on her. It was a promise and a prison. She had to keep him. Not out of love, but out of necessity. Not because she chose to, but because Dumbledore had written it so. She remembered in that moment how even when she was a girl, Dumbledore had managed to make her feel both insignificant and chosen. It was a strange cruelty. He had said no to her dreams, but he had bound her to his designs. Her life had bent around Harry not out of affection, but because a wizard had once written her name into a larger spell. She had never told Vernon about the first letter. She feared he would mock her, or worse, pity her. She feared that if she spoke the truth aloud, it would give it power. So she stayed silent, letting her resentment fester into discipline. She made Harry scrub the floors, cook the meals, stay small. But she was not punishing him, she was punishing herself. Even when Dumbledore died, Petunia did not weep. But she felt something shift. The man who had haunted her with unspoken knowledge, who had defined her rejection and her obligation, was gone. She felt relief, and guilt for that relief, because she knew he had died protecting Harry, and in a way protecting her. His death severed a tether she had never admitted existed. Years later, when Harry stood in the hallway before leaving for good, Petunia paused. She wanted to say something, not just goodbye, something real, but the words caught in her throat. She looked at him, and for a fleeting second she saw Lily's eyes. She saw the life that could have been, the sister she had betrayed, the world she had been denied, and the man who had known it all. The tragedy of Petunia Dursley was not that she hated magic. It was that she loved it once, that she longed to be part of it, and that the only man who ever acknowledged that truth was the one who denied her entry. Dumbledore was a symbol of what she could never become, and what she could never forget. When she laid awake at night, long after Harry had gone to bed, she sometimes remembered the owl, the parchment, the flame, and the second letter folded beside a baby, soft and final. She wondered if Dumbledore had planned it all. If he had known she would say yes, not out of love, but out of old wounds. And she wondered if, somewhere deep in that clever, unreadable mind, he had pitied her. Petunia never saw Hogwarts, never saw the Great Hall or the enchanted ceiling, but she had glimpsed something greater through her sister, through that letter, and through the man who had once looked at her life and chosen to draw a line. That was her curse, to live on the edge of wonder, to carry a name that meant nothing in the magical world, to be known by a man who said nothing. And yet, when she folded the letter back in 1981 and pressed it to her chest, she did not cry. She walked up the stairs, placed Harry in the cupboard, and pretended nothing had happened. But she knew, in her bones, that Dumbledore would always be watching. Not with malice, not with sympathy, just with knowledge. That was what she feared most, to be seen so completely, and still be left outside. Number 19, Vernon's secret nostalgia. There were things about Vernon Dursley that even Petunia didn't know. She believed she understood him fully. A man of routine, of clearly defined expectations, of unwavering normalcy. But Vernon had long kept a habit that didn't quite fit the image he maintained. Nearly every Wednesday evening, once the dinner plates were scrubbed and the news was mumbling in the background, Vernon would step outside with the excuse of checking on the garage. What he really did was walk. Past the neat fences and the trimmed hedges of Privet Drive, beyond the area where anyone knew his name, toward a small park not far from the shopping district. He always timed it so that he would return before it got truly dark. But for that quiet hour, he was alone with his thoughts and his curiosities. Vernon never liked to call them curiosities. That word sounded too whimsical, too much like something that might belong in one of their books. but something had shifted in him the day Harry Potter first arrived on their doorstep. It wasn't love, it wasn't acceptance, but it was a crack in the armor, a splinter no amount of grumbling could quite remove. While Vernon spent years pretending that Harry's world didn't exist, the very effort of denial made it all the more persistent in his mind. He often wandered to the park bench near the iron fence and sat there longer than necessary, staring ahead, but seeing nothing. In those moments, he wasn't sure whether he hated the world of magic or feared the way it lingered behind his every thought. It was during one of these walks that he stumbled into the little bookstore tucked between a post office and a shuttered florist shop. He'd passed it a dozen times but never entered. That day, rain had begun to fall in light, steady drops. He ducked into the store for shelter, hoping to pass the time and dry off before returning to Petunia. The bell jingled with a sound that felt almost theatrical, and he gave a snort of disapproval before stepping inside. The place smelled of old paper and waxed wood. There were no clerks in sight. He browsed in silence, certain he would find nothing of interest. The book caught his eye only because it was misfiled. On a shelf labelled Historical Biographies, between a book about Winston Churchill and one about Roman generals, sat a small volume titled The Hidden Wizard. It had a deep green cover with embossed gold lettering. No author name, no blurb, just that title. Vernon reached out, then hesitated. Something about it tugged at him. Perhaps it was the notion of hidden, the idea that someone could walk among others undetected, holding secret power. That idea had long bothered him, yet fascinated him just as much. He took the book home and didn't show Petunia. Instead, he slipped it into the pocket of his overcoat and later stashed it behind the toolbox in the garage. That night, when the house was quiet and Harry was tucked away in his cupboard, Vernon opened the book by the dim light of the single bulb. The story followed a man named Cedric Holworth, an ordinary schoolteacher in a fictional English town who secretly possessed the ability to manipulate time. Cedric never used this power in grand, showy ways. Instead, he saved seconds here, paused minutes there, avoiding car accidents, averting falls, making life easier for the people around him, all without them ever knowing. Vernon read all 212 pages in one night. It wasn't the magic that captivated him, not the floating objects or enchanted clocks. It was the duality, the notion that a man could wear a mask of dullness while possessing something great underneath. For Vernon, that had always been the terrifying part about magic. Not the spells or the creatures, but the idea that the world he controlled with routine and certainty might be constantly undermined by secrets. Years later, as Harry began receiving letters from Hogwarts, Vernon would rage louder than ever. He boarded up the mail slot, burned envelopes, dragged his family to that wretched shack on the rock. But beneath the surface of his outbursts there was something else, a fear that the mask was slipping, that the world he'd created was a thin layer of wallpaper over something more ancient and wild. He had spent so long trying to prevent Harry from becoming abnormal, but perhaps he feared what it would reveal about himself. He never mentioned the book again, not even to Petunia. But he read it 4 more times over the years, each time hidden behind piles of old boxes. There was one particular passage he dog-eared, one that Vernon found himself thinking about while staring out the kitchen window in the mornings. "The strongest magic," wrote the unnamed author, "is the kind that asks to be hidden, not flaunted. It lives in the hands of those who are willing to be misunderstood." Vernon never admitted how much that sentence unsettled him. He began paying attention to things he had once ignored, the way Harry's expression shifted when he wasn't being watched, the way Petunia flinched when magic was mentioned, not with anger, but with something close to shame. He remembered the letter that had come for her when they were still dating, how she'd torn it to pieces before he could see it. Something from a school called Ilvermorny, she had said, though he now suspected she had lied about that part too. Vernon started to wonder how many people around him lived with secrets they didn't dare reveal. Vernon remained outwardly the same. He still wore his buttoned shirts with pressed slacks, still drove to work and back, still polished the brass on the front door, but the park walks became more frequent, and the old book became worn at the edges. One winter evening he passed by the bookstore again, hoping to find something similar. But it was gone. The shop had closed, the windows covered in paper, the sign removed. Vernon stood outside for a long time, longer than he intended, staring at the empty storefront like a man searching for a door that used to be there. During Dudley's teenage years, when rebellion and change filled the Dursley house with chaos, Vernon found himself retreating even more often to solitude. He'd sit on the garage floor with the hidden wizard in hand, sometimes not reading it at all, just holding it. He had no name for the emotion it stirred in him. It wasn't regret, and it wasn't envy. It was something quieter, something that settled deep in his bones and made him feel oddly human. When Harry left for Hogwarts, Vernon breathed a sigh of relief, but he also felt the absence. The house felt too quiet. The familiar bickering, the accidental magic, even the anxiety. It was gone. Vernon could not have said it aloud, but the silence made him feel less like a gatekeeper and more like a man standing outside a locked gate. He didn't miss Harry, but he missed the part of himself that had felt, if only briefly, curious. There was a day, sometime after Harry's 4th year, when Vernon caught Dudley sneaking a look at a comic book with wizards in it. He shouted, of course, and confiscated it, but that night he flipped through the pages before tossing it into the bin. The illustrations were garish, the plot absurd, and yet he paused on one panel, a wizard with glasses, hiding in plain sight, helping those around him while pretending to be normal. It felt like an echo. Years later, after the war had ended and Harry was grown, Vernon sometimes found himself walking past King's Cross Station. Not on purpose, he told himself, but the platform sign 9 3/4 always seemed to glance at him like a whisper from the past. He never approached, never touched the wall, but he would stand nearby and stare. And once, when no one was watching, he slipped a folded page of the hidden wizard into a crack between the bricks, as if leaving a message for someone who might understand. Petunia never knew about the book. If she had, she might have burned it. Or perhaps, quietly, she would have recognized it. Maybe even read it herself once, long ago. But Vernon never asked. Some things, even between husband and wife, were better left as silent understandings. Just as he never asked her about her dreams before she became a Dursley, she never asked him why he spent so much time in the garage. The book was never published by any known company. Vernon once searched the barcode on the back, but it yielded nothing. The ISBN was a jumble. There was no publisher, no address, no records. Sometimes he wondered if the book had been meant for him, if someone or something had wanted him to read it. The idea made him uncomfortable, so he buried it deep. Still, when he passed the old bookshelf now relegated to the attic, he would sometimes reach for the book without thinking. Its spine was cracked, its pages smudged, but the final line remained clear. Not all power needs to shine. Some of it waits patiently, under coats and ties, under smiles and scowls, for someone to remember. Vernon never spoke of Cedric Halworth again, but the name stayed with him. It became the name of the imaginary colleague he mentioned whenever he needed an excuse to leave the house. Halworth called a late meeting, he'd mutter. Halworth needs someone to cover for him. No one questioned it. Vernon liked that. In the end, Vernon Dursley remained Vernon Dursley. He never embraced the world of magic, never stepped into it, but he came to terms with its shadow, its presence at the edge of things, And perhaps that quiet understanding, that secret nostalgia, was the only kind of magic he could ever allow himself. Number 20, Dudley and Muggle Therapy. In the summer following the infamous Dementor attack on Wisteria Walk, Dudley Dursley was not the same. His swagger had softened. His appetite, once voracious and uncontainable, became irregular. Vernon Dursley dismissed it as a phase, muttering about boxing and hormones. But Petunia knew better. She had watched her son change, not into someone she feared, but into someone she no longer understood. He had grown quieter, not withdrawn in the way of an angsty teenager, but somber, as if something dark had passed through him and stayed behind, pressing on his chest like a stone he couldn't remove. She never forgot the night it happened. The moment Harry burst into the kitchen, white as a sheet, dragging Dudley by the collar, while Mrs. Figg babbled frantically behind them. That night, Vernon shouted about police, about freaks, about lawsuits. But Petunia had just stared at her son, whose lips were quivering and eyes darting around like he was seeing monsters where none stood. Something had shaken him to the core. They were cold, he had whispered, and though he refused to say more, Petunia caught that phrase more than once as he mumbled in his sleep. It wasn't long before Dudley began taking longer walks alone, away from his gang. He didn't laugh at dinner the way he used to. He even snapped at his father once when Vernon joked about Harry's imaginary attacks. Petunia noticed her son sitting by the window for hours, staring out at nothing. She had made excuses to herself, growing pains, a bad fright. But when Dudley lost interest in boxing, in his dumbbells, and even in his favourite steak and kidney pie, Petunia folded. She searched for help where she never had before, the telephone book. And there, in a quiet cul-de-sac of Surrey, she found Dr. Malcolm Kerr, a discreet private psychotherapist known for handling sensitive cases without asking many questions. Their first visit was a quiet disaster. Dudley sulked, arms crossed, eyes on the floor. He refused to speak, but Dr. Kerr was patient. He had dealt with boys of Dudley's sort, privileged, large, overconfident in the outer world, but terrified by the one within. He offered no condescension, no analysis. He only asked questions like planting seeds and let them rest. By the third session, Dudley spoke. It was a rainy Thursday, Petunia waiting outside in her beige skirt and gloves, twisting her purse strap anxiously. Inside, her son said something that would change him forever. "I hate it," he admitted, voice barely a murmur. "I hate what we did to him." Dr. Kerr gently asked, "To who?" And Dudley said, "Harry, my cousin. I think we were monsters." There had been a silence after that, a long one. Dr. Kerr didn't rush to fill it. He waited, letting the weight of Dudley's confession settle like dust in the air. When he finally spoke, it was not to absolve him, but to invite him further inward. Guilt, he explained, is not proof of evil, but of conscience, and conscience, when listened to, can become redemption. The therapy continued weekly. Petunia never asked what they discussed, but she noticed her son's changes. He was gentler now, even to her. He picked up his clothes. He opened the door for elderly neighbours. Once she even caught him helping a neighbourhood boy tie his shoelaces. These may have seemed trivial acts, but for the boy who once delighted in smashing toys and tormenting cats, they were seismic shifts. Dudley never discussed the Dementors again, not with Petunia, not even with Kerr. But the image of them, the empty cloaks, the breathless horror, lingered in his behaviour. Sometimes he woke sweating. Other times he simply sat in silence, listening to the wind. At school he stopped bullying. His teachers began to write notes home. A change in behaviour, quite positive, one said. Petunia framed it, embarrassed and proud. One day Dr. Kerr gave Dudley a suggestion that would haunt him for weeks. "Perhaps," he said gently, "you should tell Harry, just tell him what you feel." Dudley had stiffened. "I can't," he muttered. "He wouldn't believe me." But the idea didn't leave him. It followed him like a ghost through dinners, walks, and sleepless nights. Then a strange thing happened. Harry came back to Privet Drive. It was not for long. He had returned to retrieve something left behind, a forgotten trunk key perhaps. Petunia didn't speak to him, nor did Vernon, but Dudley, awkward and pale, lingered in the hallway as Harry entered the house. He saw his cousin, taller now, gaunter, with eyes that had seen too much. Dudley felt his throat close up. He couldn't say the words. Instead, he left a small offering. On the table in the sitting room, he placed a mug of tea, not just any mug, but the ceramic one with the faded red stripe that Harry used when they were boys. Alongside it, a slice of Mrs. Kipling's cherry pie. Dudley didn't wait to be thanked. He left the room, heart racing, ears red. He didn't see Harry glance at the mug, then at the hallway, his face unreadable. That was the closest Dudley ever came to apology. It was silent, subtle, but full of weight. Harry never mentioned it. He took the key and left, but something passed between them that day, unsaid but real. In the years after, Petunia watched Dudley grow into someone unfamiliar. He never took up magic, of course, but he took up responsibility. He enrolled in a modest university, studied social care. "I want to help kids who get left behind," he told her one day, as if it explained everything. Petunia never admitted aloud that she was proud, but she kept every letter he sent from school, neatly pressed in a shoebox beside her gardening gloves. She often thought of Dr. Kerr. Once, at the supermarket, she ran into his secretary. "He remembers your boy," the woman said kindly. "He says he was one of the few who really listened." Sometimes, when Petunia walked past Dudley's old room, now quiet and clean, she thought of Harry. She thought of the cupboard under the stairs, the howls of Vernon, the silence of guilt. She never spoke of it. But the sight of that mug, still on the shelf in the kitchen, reminded her daily of the unspoken shift. It was Dudley who, years later, insisted his own children know their cousin's name. "Uncle Harry," he called him, and though they didn't meet often, Dudley made sure the stories his children heard were the right ones, about bravery, about kindness, about regret. "I once thought he was strange," Dudley told his daughter one day, tying her scarf before school. "But the truth is, I think he was the strongest person I ever knew." And that was perhaps the truest apology of all, not in words, not in tea or pie, but in legacy. In raising children not to fear what is different, in choosing to heal, in choosing to remember. Number 21, the unfortunate trip to Scotland. Before Dudley, Dursley was ever born, before Privet Drive became synonymous with boring normalcy and tightly trimmed hedges, Petunia Dursley had a strange and wistful longing for the past. It was a version of her childhood she rarely spoke about, filed away beneath her bitter jealousy toward her sister Lily. But just once, she let nostalgia get the better of her. That's how Vernon Dursley found himself one summer in the green, rain-drenched wilds of Scotland, staying near the ruins of a castle Petunia remembered from long forgotten. Childhood holidays, she had claimed it was the perfect place to relax before starting a family. Vernon, ever eager to please his then-young wife, agreed without protest. In hindsight, it was a decision he would deeply regret. The castle, known to the locals as Dunbury Keep, was a crumbling silhouette against the misty hills. Tourists never went near it, not due to danger, but because the local travel guides always left it out. When Vernon asked why, the woman at the inn merely said, "The place is not meant for your sort." Vernon took it as a slight and fumed silently, while Petunia stared wistfully at the hills, as though hoping to catch a glimpse of someone long gone. She never mentioned Lily by name, but Vernon was already growing suspicious. Petunia never talked about her sister, except with tightly pursed lips and muttered words about unnaturalness. That summer, however, something hung heavy in the air between them, unspoken, and ancient. The castle had no official owners, at least in the way Muggles understood ownership. To the Ministry of Magic, Dunbury Keep was registered as a Class 3 sanctuary, a temporary shelter for travelling magical beings, safe houses for wizarding families on the run, and a known checkpoint for the Order of the Phoenix during darker times. None of this, of course, was known to the Dursleys. Petunia remembered it only as the place where her parents had once taken her and Lily for a picnic. She recalled Lily chasing butterflies with wild laughter, while she sat prim and silent on the blanket, already sensing her sister was destined for a world where she would not belong. That first evening was uneventful, save for a peculiar fog that rolled in just before dusk. Vernon had insisted on bringing a wireless radio, but found to his fury that there was no signal. Petunia had packed a casserole and some cold meats in a basket, and they sat on a weathered bench eating in awkward silence. Vernon complained about the lack of television. Petunia, unusually quiet, stared at the tree line. There was something unnerving about the way the mist clung to the trees, glowing faintly silver in the moonlight, like it was made of something other than water. Sometime after midnight, Vernon was woken by a noise he would never forget. It wasn't a howl nor a shout, but something stranger, a deep, throaty groan that echoed from the forest like the cry of a living creature trying to speak. He sat bolt upright, convinced it was some drunken local, but the noise came again, this time higher pitched, almost like a whinny, but laced with a humming vibration that rattled the windows. Petunia slept soundly, a strange smile on her lips. Vernon tiptoed to the window. What he saw burned itself into his memory like a brand. Emerging from the forest was a tall figure, draped in robes, a wide leather belt across his middle, and wild hair bursting in all directions. His beard was thick and tangled, and he walked with the heavy steps of a giant. Behind him, tethered by a thick cord, was a creature Vernon could only describe later as glowing madness. It was quadrupedal, taller than a horse, with fur that shimmered like liquid pearl. Its eyes shone gold. The figure, who Vernon would later unknowingly recognize in a photograph as Rubeus Hagrid, patted the beast's side gently and whispered something before they vanished around the corner of the castle, out of sight. By sunrise, Vernon was already loading the car. He told Petunia they were leaving immediately. She asked no questions. Perhaps she too had seen something in her sleep, something her rational mind rejected. Or perhaps she knew more than she let on and feared what Vernon might begin to suspect. Whatever the case, she remained uncharacteristically silent during the entire drive back to Surrey. Years later, when Petunia would lecture Dudley about staying away from strange people, or mutter threats about ending up like your aunt, Vernon would nod along vehemently, but his mind would drift, not to Lily Potter, nor even to her freakish son, but to that night in Scotland, to the castle, to the beast, to the robed figure whose very presence made the air buzz. The further away from those places, the better, he would often say. Mountains, forests, all crawling with, well, you know what. He never again allowed a family vacation anywhere that resembled wilderness. Beaches were acceptable, so long as they had a 4-star hotel. Cities were preferred, but he banned any mention of Scotland in their household. Even Petunia seemed reluctant to contradict him. She resumed her normal icy tone when speaking of Lily and forbade the name Hogwarts from ever being uttered. But that trip had unlocked something in both of them, something they'd tried desperately to bury, Petunia's memories and Vernon's fear. A lesser-known passage in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone quietly supports this forgotten chapter in the Dursley timeline. When Hagrid arrives to deliver Harry's letter on the island, Vernon blurts out, "I knew it! I knew you'd be one of them!" The way he says them is loaded with more than just disdain. It's coloured by fear. He goes on to rant, "I swore when we took him in we'd put a stop to all that rubbish." Rubbish in Vernon's world meant chaos. And the trip to Scotland had given him a taste of it. untamed, unexplainable, uninvited. Petunia, too, seems to carry the memory. In Order of the Phoenix, when she receives the howler from Dumbledore, her face turns pale as she hears the name, "Remember, my last." Readers have long speculated about what Dumbledore meant, but it's plausible that part of Petunia's obedience came from fear not only of what Dumbledore could do, but of what she had already seen. She had glimpsed that world. She had once stood beside it, and she had been burned. A curious Ministry of Magic report buried deep in the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes refers cryptically to a Muggle encounter at Dunbury Keep, 1979. No names are listed, but the date aligns perfectly. The report notes that the incident required no memory modification, as the Muggles left of their own volition before any direct engagement. The report concludes, the male displayed a classic overreaction response, fear, denial, displacement. The female, despite possible prior exposure to magical phenomena, offered no resistance. It is unknown why Hagrid was in the Highlands that night. Some theorize he was searching for wounded thestrals or unicorns. Others whisper that the Order had a meeting at Dunbury Keep that night, using the creature as cover. Whatever the reason, his appearance permanently rewired Vernon's understanding of the world. Before, magic had been an abstract enemy, something that corrupted Petunia's sister, and now threatened to corrupt her nephew. After the trip, it became something real, something with shape and smell and sound. Vernon would never speak of the event again, not even to Petunia, but the experience deepened his hostility toward magic. It wasn't mere bigotry or discomfort, it was dread. That dread infected his every interaction with Harry, every glare, every grumble. When Dumbledore appeared in their home in Half-Blood Prince, Vernon was not just enraged, he was terrified. He kept looking toward the hallway, as though expecting something else to follow the old wizard through the door. Maybe a glowing beast, maybe something worse. This secret piece of history, the lost trip, the hidden memory, adds weight to Vernon's hatred. It wasn't arbitrary, it was forged in the shadow of an ancient keep, among stones older than the Ministry itself. Magic had touched him, not as wonder, but as fear. And for a man like Vernon Dursley, whose entire identity hinged on structure and control, that was the deepest cut of all. The memory haunted his dreams. Though he'd never admit it, Vernon sometimes woke in the middle of the night, sweating, convinced he heard hoofbeats or a low growl outside the window. In his nightmares, the creature's eyes would glow through the fog, and the robed man would turn toward him, not with malice, but with something worse, recognition, as if to say, "I remember you." Petunia never asked to return. The photograph she kept in the attic, taken decades ago by her mother at the base of the Scottish hills, eventually faded with age. In it, two girls stand side by side, one laughing, wand behind her back, the other frowning into the lens. The stone wall behind them is the same one Vernon had leaned against that terrible night. In the photo, the mist is beginning to roll in. You can just make out the shape of something glowing in the distance. Years later, when Harry stood on the same soil in a different battle, he never knew the strange link the land held to his own story. The hills of Scotland had once held the laughter of two sisters, the silent dread of a frightened man, and the slow erosion of a marriage built on secrets. Vernon and Petunia never told Dudley, they never told anyone, but something had changed that day, and from then on the world of magic was not just unwelcome in their home, it was forbidden. Number 22, The Hidden Childhood Photos. Petunia Dursley never spoke of the past. She had trained herself to erase all traces of what once was, memories, words, emotions, as if Lily Evans had never existed, and yet, on a dusty shelf above the coats in the narrow hallway closet of number 4, Privet Drive, there lay an album, a thick, padded thing, its once bright blue cover now faded to grey, its golden trim frayed. It was buried under decades of forgotten clutter. Dudley's old pram wheel, Vernon's abandoned electric drill, a box of plastic Christmas lights long since tangled into useless knots. But it remained. Petunia had not thrown it away. It was by chance that Harry found it. He was 15 and had been forced into his annual spring chore, washing the windows from the outside. Petunia had sent him up the ladder with a bucket and sponge and strict instructions not to chip the paint. As he leaned into the frame, struggling with a stubborn smear, his foot nudged a stack of boxes in the hallway closet. The top one teetered, then fell, and from the corner of his eye, Harry saw the album slide from the shelf and land with a muffled thud. Petunia's reaction was instantaneous. She must have heard the sound from the kitchen. By the time Harry turned around, she was already there, pale and furious, snatching the album from the floor with a trembling hand. She didn't scold him, she didn't explain, she simply clutched the album to her chest and left the hallway, shutting the closet door as if slamming shut a tomb. Harry never saw the album again. But what he had glimpsed in those seconds, the cover, the pages flared open, the flash of red hair, a girl's laugh captured mid-moment, etched itself in his mind. The photographs inside that album were old, some curled at the corners, others slightly faded by time. They captured a world untouched by magic, a world of summer dresses and sticky fingers, of sisters running barefoot through the grass, of Lily Evans before wands and spells, before potions and Quidditch, before Snape and Hogwarts and the prophecy that would doom them all. They were children in those photographs, and Petunia, stiff, cautious, often jealous, still smiled. There was one picture Harry would never forget. He had seen it for only a second before Petunia snatched the album away. Lily was standing beside a snowman, carrot nose slightly askew, her gloves too big for her hands. Her cheeks were flushed, and she was laughing. Not just smiling politely, but laughing, the kind of deep, delighted laugh that made her eyes crinkle. Petunia stood beside her, wearing a woolen coat 2 sizes too big, her smile crooked and real. It was the Lily Harry had seen in dreams. For years Harry had imagined his mother. He had only the tiniest of clues, Hagrid's words. "You look a lot like her." Sirius's bittersweet memories, Dumbledore's mournful silence. But nothing had ever made her feel real. Not until that photo. And that was what shook him the most. Because that Lily wasn't a hero or a martyr or a name on a gravestone. She was a sister. Petunia had preserved that version of her. She had kept those photos even when she had burned the letters from Hogwarts, even when she had lied to Dudley about that awful woman, even when she had scrubbed the house of every magical trace after baby Harry had been left on their doorstep. She had kept the photos not out of love for Lily the witch, but for Lily, the girl, the laughing child who shared her bed on stormy nights and whispered secrets under the covers. It wasn't affection that held Petunia back from throwing the album away. It was loss, a quiet, stubborn loss that no one in Little Whinging would understand. To everyone else, Petunia Dursley was a sharp woman with a loud voice and an even louder son. But inside, in the locked room of her memory, she was still the girl who once tried to do cartwheels like her younger sister and always landed on her knees. There is no mention of the album in any official account. The books, with their urgency and darkness, never dwell on the inner world of Petunia Dursley. But the album was real. Harry's recollection was too vivid to be a lie. He saw Lily there, living, breathing, not the tragic shadow preserved in the mirror of Erist or the cold echo left behind by Dementors. This small act of memory ahen of keeping those photographs redefined Petunia in Harry's eyes. Not entirely, not with forgiveness, but with something close to understanding. In the Order of the Phoenix, when Harry leaves number 4, under the protection of the Order, Petunia says only one thing of meaning. "You didn't just lose a mother that night in Godric's Hollow, you know. I lost a sister." The words were forced, nearly bitter. But they were also true. Petunia's life after Lily's death was a tapestry of denial. She reshaped the world so she would never have to acknowledge what had happened. She taught herself to hate magic. She clung to Vernon's solid, predictable values. She smothered Dudley with attention. But she never got rid of the album. That one act of preservation was her betrayal of everything else she pretended to believe. The album didn't just contain photos of Lily. It held images of a time when Petunia hadn't yet grown bitter, when she wasn't yet consumed by resentment. The snowman, the Christmas tree, the backyard sprinkler. Those weren't just images. They were reminders of a childhood that ended the moment the Hogwarts letter arrived for Lily, and not for her. It is well known among fans that Petunia once wrote to Dumbledore asking to attend Hogwarts. She had begged to be allowed into that world, Lily's world, but she was denied. "You are not a witch," Dumbledore had written. "I am sorry." That rejection didn't just close a door, it built a wall, and for the rest of her life Petunia never looked over it. Except sometimes when she opened that album in secret. The contradiction was powerful. Here was a woman who claimed to loathe magic, who called Harry's parents freaks, who celebrated normalcy with obsessive rigor, and yet she preserved those memories, fragile, precious, utterly ordinary, of the sister she had both envied and loved. The photos were not enchanted. They didn't move like the ones Harry saw in the wizarding world. They were still, silent, human, and perhaps that's why Petunia kept them, because they showed Lily not as a witch, but as a girl. It wasn't love that drove Petunia to raise Harry. It was obligation, a bitter promise extracted by Dumbledore's letter left with the child. But keeping the album, that wasn't obligation. That was choice. A quiet, guilty defiance against the tidy version of the world she tried so hard to create. There were nights when Petunia would tiptoe into the hallway, unlock the closet and lift the album down. Always alone, always late. She would sit at the kitchen table, the lights dimmed, a cup of tea forgotten beside her. She would turn the pages slowly. Her fingers would linger over Lily's face, her own younger self. She would remember the songs they sang on the swing set, the secrets they whispered about the neighbour's cat, the afternoon Lily made her a daisy chain and crowned her queen of summer. And she would feel, not joy, not peace, but something that hovered between sorrow and sweetness. Nostalgia, maybe, or regret. She never told Vernon. He wouldn't have understood. He believed her entirely when she said she had no family. He repeated that lie so often it became routine. But the album was her truth, her private contradiction, her wound that never quite healed. She had banished Lily in life and in death, but not from memory. And in that memory, Lily was never a witch. She was a sister, a girl in a red scarf, her nose pink from the cold, holding Petunia's hand as they ran down the hill behind the playground, a girl with freckles and grass stains and a laugh that echoed like sunlight through the leaves. She was alive in those photos, vividly, achingly alive, in a way that nothing else could replicate. For Harry, the brief glimpse of that album changed something too. It gave him a version of his mother he had never seen. Not the warrior or the martyr, but the child. And it gave him a glimpse of Petunia as someone who had once loved, who had once lost, and who had never fully recovered. The photo of the snowman, the blurry one with the Christmas tree, the summer picture where Lily squints into the sun. They were anchors. Proof that before the war, before the spells and prophecies, there was a family, imperfect, tense, but real. And at the heart of it were two sisters, one magical, one not, who had once built a snowman together and laughed until they fell in the snow. Petunia Dursley would never speak of that album, but she kept it, and sometimes that's louder than words. Number 23, what happened to number 4? Privet Drive. After the war, little whinging remained much the same. The hedges were still trimmed with suburban precision, the air still hummed with lawnmowers on Saturdays, and the houses on Privet Drive still looked as indistinguishably neat as ever. But number 4 held a different weight. There was something frozen about it, like time had stopped on the very day Harry Potter turned his back on the house for the last time. No one saw the Dursleys leave. One morning their car was gone, the curtains were drawn shut, and a faint imprint of heavy furniture remained on the carpet visible through the window. Vernon Dursley never came back for his golf clubs. Petunia never called her sister's name again with that sharpness in her voice. And Dudley, he left behind a single sneaker in the hallway, the laces still tied. The house stood empty for years. Real estate agents would sometimes list it, but no sale ever seemed to go through. Something always went wrong. A buyer changed their mind last minute, a sudden leak appeared where no pipes ran, or documents went missing mysteriously. Mrs. Number 6, a nosy woman named Joyce Cattermole, no relation to Reginald, insisted the place was cursed. "I've lived here 32 years, she was often heard saying, and that house has been wrong since the summer of '97. She remembered the night of the silent departure. She said she felt the air crackle. Like before a thunderstorm, but worse, like the house was exhaling. It was only years later that the lights began to appear. Small at first, just a flicker, always from the same room. The one over the stair landing, Harry's old bedroom. Teenagers dared each other to peek in through the window at dusk. Some claimed they saw a boy in there, writing by candlelight. Others swore there were no curtains, and yet a shadow moved. The electricity had long been shut off, so when Joyce Cattermole called the council to report energy theft, nothing came of it. "No one's on the meter," the technician said, scratching his head. "It's like no one's been living there in 15 years. Then came the boy. His name was Thomas Albury, 12 years old, newly orphaned, and assigned to a foster home that just happened to be number 4, Privet Drive. The council had finally cleared the paperwork, and a couple from out of town had taken up residence with him. The couple, Sandra and Philip Dunn, reported nothing unusual. "It's just a house," Sandra told her colleagues. "Smells a little like roses and dust." But Thomas noticed things they didn't. The way the air was cooler in the cupboard under the stairs. The way the walls seemed to hum if you pressed your ear to them. He found the silence comforting, though. He liked the weight of the place, like it held secrets that might be worth uncovering. It was on a rainy Sunday afternoon that Thomas found the compartment. He'd been playing with a wooden top, a simple toy he'd brought from his last home, and it rolled under a loose floorboard in the upstairs hallway. When he pulled it up, expecting only dust, he found a hollow space lined with crumbling newspaper. Inside were 3 items, a tiny brass button, a folded piece of paper with childish handwriting, and a dry, perfectly preserved lily petal. He took them to his room and stared at them, unsure why they made his throat tighten. The button had a faint green shimmer in the light. It didn't seem special, but it felt warm in his hand. The note was more curious. Written in crooked letters, it read, "Don't forget me, I was here." There was no name, but the G in forget was drawn with a little tail, the kind a small child might make when trying to be fancy. The petal was the strangest of all. It was fragile, sure, but not brittle. It hadn't crumbled like any other dried flower, and it still held a trace of scent. Thomas, who'd never known much about flowers, had the distinct impression it had once been white. The house responded to the finding. That night, the boy heard a sound from the cupboard under the stairs. It wasn't a thump or a creak, but a soft sigh, as if the house were remembering. He went to the door and opened it. Nothing there, just an old spiderweb and a faint scratch on the back wall. But when he leaned in, he saw something else, a carved name. Harry. The letters were rough, uneven, likely done with a nail or a dull knife, but they were there. Beneath it, the words, "I survived." In a later visit to the public library, Thomas found a book on wizarding history. He didn't know why he picked it. The cover was dusty, the kind of book the library hadn't loaned out in years. It had been misfiled among children's tales. In the back was an index. "Potter, Harry, see Battle of Hogwarts?" Thomas read for an hour. He read until the lights flickered and the old librarian came to scold him for staying past closing. He didn't understand everything, but he understood this. The house had belonged to someone important, and the petal, the lily, was no coincidence. Petunia Dursley never returned to the house, but she left more than she realized. In one of the council records, a social worker's note mentioned a letter that arrived months after the war ended. It was addressed simply, "The woman who watched from the window." No return address. Inside it said only, "He lived, that should be enough." Some believed it was from Professor McGonagall. Others whispered the name Aberforth. Petunia never spoke of it. She'd moved to the coast by then, reclusive and quiet. When she died in 2009, her obituary mentioned only one child, Dudley, and made no reference to her sister. Dudley had changed, that much is known. The last time Harry saw him, the handshake lingered too long to be awkward. "I don't think you're a waste of space," Dudley had said, and he meant it. He never returned to Privet Drive either, but he paid for its upkeep for years, quietly, through a firm in London. He told no one. The payments stopped only in 2021, shortly after the flickering lights began again. Some magical historians believe the house absorbed a kind of ambient magic, the lingering effects of Lily Potter's protection. "Magic doesn't just vanish," Bathilda Bagshot once wrote. "It clings, it echoes." The protection that once kept Harry alive had been anchored to the house. Though the charm itself ended when Harry came of age, its shadow remained, etched into the wood, the brick, the very soil of the rose garden. It made the house, not alive exactly, but aware. One Aura trainee named Miriam Fleet, investigating a string of accidental magic reports from Surrey, visited the house in 2023. She found no trace of spells or wand work. But she did report an unusual stillness, like walking into someone's memory. She also noted a faint smell of old parchment and rosewater. The ministry closed the case, marking it as residual enchantment. The boy Thomas grew quieter. He didn't tell anyone about the note or the petal, but sometimes he sat on the stairs and read books by candlelight. He said it helped him sleep. When Sandra Dunn once asked why he did that, he said the lights in the room upstairs didn't work the same way. "Sometimes they hum," he said, "like they're waiting." A year later, Thomas moved to a different foster home. The Dunns, unable to have children of their own, had adopted another boy. Number 4 was rented again, this time to a couple with no children. But the humming never stopped. On certain nights, a soft light still appeared in the window. Not electric, not candlelight, something in between. The neighbours stopped asking questions. Mrs. Cattermole moved to Bournemouth and left no forwarding address. Years passed and the house became the subject of niche magical folklore. Wizards debated whether it had become a thin place, a location where the barrier between the magical and muggle world was unusually porous. "It's the magic of memory," said Luna Lovegood in an article for The Quibbler. "Places remember, especially places that held love, fear, and protection in equal measure." She visited once, wearing bright orange boots and a necklace of butterbeer caps. She stood on the pavement for exactly 7 minutes, then turned and said, "It's humming in the key of D minor. That's the key of longing." The rose bush by the front window never died, not once in 30 years. It bloomed even in winter, though no gardener ever tended it. A local boy once picked a blossom and brought it home to his mother. It wilted within the hour, and the boy fell into a feverish sleep, whispering names he couldn't remember upon waking. The rosebush was left alone after that. In 2030, magical maintenance quietly sealed off the property with protective charms disguised as a Muggle condemned notice. Officially, the house was marked for demolition, but no contractors ever arrived. Behind the scenes, a small team of researchers from the Department of Mysteries began monitoring the location. They recorded low-frequency magical fluctuations consistent with deep residual spells. One unspeakable, who asked to remain unnamed, stated, "It's as if the house is waiting for someone or something." No one knows what became of the button or the note or the lily petal. Thomas Albury, now an adult, never spoke publicly of them, but in an obscure publication dedicated to magical architecture, a one-page anonymous submission once appeared. It read, "Some houses aren't haunted by ghosts but by echoes, echoes of boys who lived in cupboards, of mothers who loved beyond death, and of promises made in silence. The door is still there. It just needs the right key." Number 4 remains, not just a house, but a witness. It stands as it always has, prim, square, and so very normal on the outside. But inside, something lingers, something quiet, something that remembers. Number 24, the unknown grandmother, a witch in the family. Agatha Winston was a name barely whispered in the Dursley household, a name buried beneath layers of denial and disdain. Yet among the tea-stained pages of an old photo album, there existed a single photograph of her, wedged between birthday cards and formal portraits. In that image, Agatha stood tall, her back slightly arched, cloaked in what could only be described as a deep purple mantle, stitched with unfamiliar patterns, a pendant glimmering at her chest like a captured moonbeam. It was Lily who discovered the photograph in her youth, hidden behind a loose flap in the album's leather binding. Petunia had slammed the book shut the moment she saw it, muttering something about costume parties and silly old women. Agatha's presence in the Evans household was short-lived but unforgettable. She passed away when Petunia was no older than 4, and Lily just 2. Even at that age, Petunia remembered her with an eerie clarity, not in details but in feelings. She described her later in life as unsettling, as someone who would sit in the garden and murmur into the breeze, as though it might carry her words to unseen ears. Their mother, Helen Evans, rarely spoke of Agatha, though she kept a small tin of dried herbs in the kitchen labelled "for fevers." The smell was sharp, lavender mixed with something earthier, almost metallic. When asked about it, Helen simply said, "It was your grandmother's recipe. It works better than anything from Boots." The whispers around Agatha Winston didn't stop at her herb lore. The neighbours, especially old Mrs. Hardgrove, who lived 2 doors down, used to say Agatha could find anything that was lost. Once, when Helen misplaced her wedding ring during a summer picnic, Agatha closed her eyes, held out her hand, and pointed toward the base of the rosebush. There it was, half buried in damp earth, just where she'd said. Instinct, she had claimed, but Mrs. Hardgrove was not so easily convinced. She was overheard telling the greengrocer that Agatha Winston talks to the wind, and the wind talks back. When Lily began showing signs of magic, it was Agatha's memory that stirred first in Helen's mind. She noticed the way her youngest daughter could make flowers bloom without touching them, the way her mood affected the weather in the garden. "Just like Mother," Helen whispered once while folding laundry, her voice so low Petunia barely heard it. But she remembered it. That sentence rooted itself in her heart like a bitter weed. Because if Lily was just like Mother, then what did that make Petunia? Petunia wanted order. She longed for predictability, for simple cause and effect. Agatha Winston had been the opposite of that. Unpredictable, mysterious, and strangely revered by Lily, who would sit under the willow tree and talk to the empty air, just as Agatha had done. There was a day when Petunia, around 7 years old, saw Lily sitting cross-legged on the grass, her hands pressed to the soil. "I can feel her," Lily said. "She's not gone." That night, Petunia cried in her bed, feeling displaced by something ancient and unknowable, something that didn't seem to touch her life at all, except to make her feel excluded from her own bloodline. The moment Lily received her letter from Hogwarts, Helen had gone pale, but not surprised. She closed her eyes and nodded slowly. "I suppose it was always going to happen," she said. "She takes after Mother." Vernon Dursley never knew this. Petunia never told him. She couldn't. It would unravel too much. She had spent years claiming her family was perfectly normal, thank you very much. But in truth, the roots of her bloodline coiled into something older, something forgotten, or rather, something deliberately buried. It was James Potter who once asked Lily where her magic came from. "We're Muggle-born," she had said, "but my mum's side." Well, there was someone, Agatha Winston. "My mum never called her a witch, but sometimes I think she was." Lily had laughed, brushing off her own words, but James had paused. "You said she used to speak to the wind?" he asked. "And your magic came in early, right?" It was unusual, even in magical circles, for a child to show such pronounced talent so young. But Lily did. By the time she was 5, her accidental magic had become impossible to ignore. Severus Snape had once seen that photograph too. Before the days of rivalry and heartbreak, when they were still two curious children digging through closets and corners, Lily showed it to him. "That's her," she said. "That's the one Mum never talks about." The picture was black and white, but Snape noted the pendant. "That's an Eye of Oswin," he whispered, recognizing the ancient magical symbol. "It's used for protection and concealment. Very old magic." He had stared at the photograph a long time, but Lily eventually slipped it back into the album and returned it to its hiding place. If Agatha Winston was indeed a witch, then her powers had gone mostly unnoticed, or had been hidden. There were cases, rare ones, of magical folk who had chosen to live outside the wizarding world, never registering with the ministry, never sending their children to Hogwarts. These people were often referred to in wizarding history as the quiet wands, those who practiced in secret, out of fear or a desire for solitude. Agatha fit the profile disturbingly well. Born in 1894, she had lived through the Great War and died in 1962, just a few years before the Statute of Secrecy enforcement measures were revised and strengthened. If she was a quiet wand, she would have passed without notice. Petunia's fear wasn't just of magic. It was of the pull it had, how it attracted people to Lily, how it filled the air with something she could neither understand nor resist. Even in childhood, Lily had glowed in the presence of Agatha's old things. There was a ring box in the attic with dried sage and rose quartz inside, a silk scarf embroidered with runes. Once, Petunia had found Lily standing in front of the mirror with the scarf tied around her shoulders, whispering something under her breath. "What are you doing?" she had snapped. Lily only smiled and said, "Practicing." When the war against Voldemort erupted, Agatha's name surfaced once more, not publicly, but among those who tracked magical bloodlines and heritage. A researcher named Marius Flint wrote a short paper, never published, on forgotten maternal conduits of magic in Muggle-born witches. In it, he mentioned a case study he simply called the Winston Line. According to his notes, Agatha had once been offered a place at a lesser-known magical academy in Cornwall, but declined. There was no record of wand purchase, no formal training. A latent power, perhaps, he wrote, channeled through domestic rituals and herb lore. The ministry dismissed it as folk speculation. For Petunia, it was easier to pretend Agatha had never existed, to rewrite the family story with scissors and glue. She crafted her narrative with precision: normal parents, normal childhood, and an inexplicably freakish sister. In the years after Lily's death, when she raised Harry under her roof, She enforced that narrative with even greater severity. But one night, years before the events at Privet Drive, Petunia had taken out the photo album again. She looked at Agatha's face. The pendant, she now remembered, had a sigil on it, 3 spirals joined at the centre, a triskel, a symbol of balance, of cycles, of past, present, and future entwined. That night, she had dreams, strange ones. She saw Agatha standing in the garden again, but the flowers were blooming in reverse. She spoke no words, but her lips moved, and the wind carried her message through the trees. When Petunia woke up, she dismissed it as nonsense, but she avoided mirrors for a few days, just in case. Harry never knew about Agatha Winston. No one ever told him. Her name was not mentioned in letters or portraits or bedtime stories. But perhaps her influence lived on in Lily's protection spell, in the kind of magic that bloomed from love, not lineage. Perhaps it was Agatha's legacy that made Lily so powerful, that allowed her sacrifice to create a magic stronger than the Dark Lord's curse. It wasn't written in any book at Hogwarts, but not all magic is. When Petunia stood beside Harry at the train station years later, her lips tight and eyes distant, she almost said something. Almost. She glanced at the pendant Ginny wore, handed down from Molly perhaps, or older still, and for a fleeting second she saw Agatha's triskel glinting once more. She turned away. And maybe that was Agatha's last spell, not one cast with a wand, but one planted in memory, in story, in fear and fascination, a seed buried deep enough to grow even in silence. Number 25. Lily's unread letter. Of all the secrets buried within number 4, Privet Drive, one has remained untouched by time, hidden not behind magic, but behind emotion. A small envelope, yellowing with age, resting silently in an old box in the attic. It bore no spells, no enchantments, and no demands. It was sealed with ordinary wax and written in the same careful hand that once penned school letters, shopping lists, and notes of love. It was Lily Potter's last letter to her sister, a letter that, by the cruel trick of fate and magic, arrived too late to do what it was meant to do, heal something broken. The existence of the letter is known to only a few, whispered among the rare documents left behind by the Dursleys after their hurried departure from Privet Drive during the Second Wizarding War. It was found by a Muggle appraiser cataloguing the contents of the house, confused by the reference to names that no official records seemed to recognize. But to those who have studied the Potter family history, this small note offers a haunting insight into the final days before the Dark Lord's attack on Godric's Hollow. Lily had written to Petunia just days before she and James were murdered. The war was escalating. Voldemort had begun targeting families, and the Order of the Phoenix was stretched thin. It was the last moment of quiet before the storm. And in that fragile sliver of time, Lily picked up a Muggle pen and wrote, not as a witch or a mother on the run, but as a sister. Her words were plain, stripped of their usual defensiveness, unguarded and painfully sincere. She wrote, "I miss you. I want Harry to know his aunt. Come, just for a day. Only you and me, like it used to be." The letter did not travel by Flu network or magical means. Lily chose a regular owl, fearing that any trace of magic might expose them further, but the growing instability of protective enchantments around Godric's Hollow confused the bird. For nearly 2 weeks the owl circled unfamiliar territory before reaching Surrey. When the envelope landed in the letterbox of the Dursleys, its sender had already been dead for 5 days. Petunia Dursley never opened the letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately, the looping script that had once been so familiar. She held it in trembling hands, her breath caught between past and present, and then placed it in a drawer beneath unpaid bills and recipes clipped from women's magazines. A week later, she moved it to a tin box marked Miscellaneous, storing it on the attic's lowest shelf, beneath old school uniforms and Dudley's broken toys. There it remained, untouched by Vernon, unknown to Dudley, and unseen by Harry. though he had passed beneath that roof for years. What had kept her from reading it? Perhaps pride, perhaps guilt, perhaps something older and more difficult to name. The grief of being left behind, of being ordinary. Petunia had always resented the way Lily's world stole her away. She had tried to follow once, begging Dumbledore to let her attend Hogwarts. He had denied her. "You are not a witch," he wrote. Petunia never forgave the world that had chosen Lily instead. But the letter was not about magic. It was about two girls who had once shared a room, laughed under bedcovers with a torch, and made promises to never grow apart. The letter would have arrived on October 31st, 1981, had the owl not gotten lost. Instead, it reached the Dursleys on November 5th, the day the wizarding world held its breath and celebrated Voldemort's fall. Witches and wizards rejoiced. Muggles saw odd fireworks and heard distant booms. Petunia, however, sat in silence at the kitchen table, the unopened envelope beside her teacup. Vernon was at work. Dudley was napping in his crib. Petunia ran her thumb over the seal, then she placed it back in the drawer, and never spoke of it again. Years later, when Albus Dumbledore left Harry on that doorstep with only a letter of explanation tucked in the blanket, Petunia read that one. She scowled at its tone and burned it the same evening. But Lily's letter, the one written out of longing, not duty, was spared. It was never thrown away, even when she could have. Through house cleanings and spring purges, it remained where she had hidden it. Some part of her had known it mattered. The attic of number 4 was rarely visited. Petunia hated dust, but once, around Harry's 7th birthday, she climbed up there to store Christmas decorations early. She lingered at the box. Her hand hovered above it. But she left without opening it. Below her, Harry sat on the floor of his cupboard, tracing the grain of the wooden floorboards, completely unaware that his mother's voice, her final voice, was boxed above him. That letter is not mentioned in any ministry record. It is not part of Albus Dumbledore's vast correspondence, nor is it found in the archives of the Order. But it lives in the shadows of the story, in that attic, in that silence. Some historians argue it explains Petunia's rare moments of softness, the slight tremble in her voice when she handed Harry his mother's blanket, the way she hesitated before calling her sister a freak. Others believe she never read it, that the mere existence of the envelope haunted her more than the contents ever could. When Harry returned to Privet Drive for the last time before going into hiding with the Order, he found the house emptier than usual. The Dursleys were already gone, relocated under wizarding protection. Creature accompanied him, muttering disapproval about the Dursleys' decor. But in the attic, beneath the dust, Harry found the tin box. He lifted the lid and found scraps of old papers, school drawings, and one envelope with fading ink. Petunia Evans, it said. Not Dursley. Evans. Harry stared at it for a long time. He recognized the handwriting. He had seen it before, in the margins of the photograph album Hagrid had given him, in the corner of an old recipe tucked in Sirius's kitchen drawer. It was his mother's hand. He did not open it. Perhaps he feared what it might contain. Perhaps he understood that it wasn't addressed to him. He placed it back in the tin and left it behind. Some say Dudley later returned and found the letter. That he opened it, read it, and wept. That he placed it in the same envelope and sealed it again, returning it to its quiet resting place. Others believe the letter was lost when the house was sold and cleared, but the legend of the letter endures. It speaks to what was lost between two sisters. The magic not of spells, but of forgiveness, of childhood, of love unspoken and unanswered. Vernon Dursley never knew about the letter. If he had, he might have demanded it be destroyed. He had no patience for reminders of Lily or the world she came from. For him, Lily was a shadow on Petunia's face, a ghost in their family tree. But Petunia, in whatever her flaws, had once loved her sister. That love had been twisted by resentment, but it had not vanished entirely. And in that unopened letter, it might have found its final echo. Throughout the books, Petunia is a figure of quiet bitterness, but once, in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Dumbledore tells Harry, "She may have taken you grudgingly, furiously, unwillingly, bitterly, yet she still took you." That line has long puzzled readers. Why did Petunia agree? Was it fear, obligation, or was there something else, something softer, hidden deep beneath layers of disdain? The letter, perhaps, is the key, not because it contained a secret, but because it didn't. It held only a sister's voice, stripped of defenses. That voice might have reminded Petunia of who she used to be before the jealousy, before the bitterness, before Vernon, a girl who once believed in magic because her sister believed in it. To imagine Petunia sitting at her table, the letter unopened, is to imagine a moment of unbearable humanity. Not villainy, not cruelty, but the tragedy of pride. She could have opened it. She could have gone to Lily. And had she done so? Had she spent just one day with her sister and nephew? Perhaps the future would have shifted. Perhaps Harry would have grown up not in a cupboard, but in a room, with stories of his mother not told by strangers, but remembered by blood. The attic no longer exists. The house has new tenants. But in wizarding circles, the letter has become a kind of symbol, not just of missed chances, but of silent hope. It remains one of the only surviving objects from the last days of the Potters. Unlike wands or photographs, it is pure memory, untouched by magic, and that is why it still matters. It is said that Lily charmed almost everything she owned. Her letters to James would sparkle with protective runes. Her messages to Remus and Sirius had vanishing ink. But this one, to Petunia, had nothing. It needed no magic, just truth. And perhaps in the end, that's why it hurts the most. Because the truth arrived too late, and no spell in the world could open a heart that had already decided to remain closed. Number 26. Dudley's attempt to reconnect with Harry. Of all the hidden stories scattered like forgotten petals through the pages of Harry's life, one of the most human and quietly powerful begins with a badly folded letter, smudged in places with the oil from trembling fingers. Vernon Dursley's legacy had long loomed over Harry Potter like a grey, square-shaped cloud full of fists and silence. Yet when Harry unfolded a thick envelope one evening in his study, long after the Battle of Hogwarts had passed into public legend, the ink inside came not from Vernon nor Petunia, but from Dudley. Dudley Dursley, whose name still stirred an instinctive tension in Harry's chest, had written him something no one could have expected. The letter was almost painful to read, not because it carried insults or threats, but because it bore the clumsy earnestness of someone trying to use muscles that had never known gentleness. Dudley's handwriting was jagged and awkward, as if each letter had been pressed into the parchment like a punch. The spelling was off, punctuation missing entirely in places, but the message broke through clearly enough. "I don't know why we were like that," Dudley had scrawled. "Maybe because we were taught that way. I'm not saying sorry, just maybe one day we could have dinner. No fists, no pokes, just people." Harry had stared at the letter for a long time. He hadn't spoken to Ginny about it, nor to Ron or Hermione. He simply folded it back and slipped it into a drawer. He hadn't even noticed that his hand was shaking. Years earlier, during the final days before he left Privet Drive for the last time, there had been a moment, a fleeting one, when Dudley had shown the first crack in the Dursley wall of contempt. "I don't think you're a waste of space," he'd said, awkwardly, with the grace of a hippogriff trying to dance. Harry had accepted it in silence, but never quite known what to do with it. This letter, sent more than a decade later, was perhaps a continuation of that moment. By the time Harry received the letter, James was nearly 10 and already showing signs of magical mischief. Albus, ever the quieter one, often curled up beside the fire with a book. Lily would storm into rooms like a burst of colour, leaving laughter in her wake. Harry had built a life far from Privet Drive, not just in location, but in spirit. He no longer flinched at the sound of cupboard doors, yet this letter had pulled something old and fragile from within him, something he hadn't named in years. He didn't respond immediately. He let the letter rest among old Hogwarts letters and a few notes from Sirius, but something kept bringing him back to it. He found himself imagining Dudley, not the snarling, red-faced bully of his youth, but an adult, perhaps awkward in his own skin, trying to raise children of his own, trying to figure out what parts of his upbringing to bury and what parts to salvage. It was a strange thought. Dudley Dursley as a father? Eventually, curiosity nudged Harry beyond silence. He did not send a letter, not right away. Instead, one cold afternoon in early spring, he took his children, just James and Albus at the time, and travelled to a quiet park outside London. He didn't tell them much, only that they were meeting someone from his childhood. When Dudley arrived, he was wearing a blazer that didn't quite fit, his hair slightly too short, his hands constantly searching for somewhere to rest. The meeting was awkward. Neither man seemed to know how to sit across from the other, without instinctively preparing for some kind of attack. Dudley brought coffee in a brown bag and offered it as though it were an olive branch. James was the first to laugh, at nothing in particular, and Dudley relaxed a little. They spoke stiffly about the weather, about how different things were now. Dudley mentioned his wife, a kind woman named Rebecca, and their daughter, Emma. "She doesn't really understand any of, Dudley said, waving vaguely, the wand stuff. Harry smiled and explained that most people didn't, but then, to Dudley's surprise, James conjured a small blue butterfly in his hand, and Lily made it dance when she joined them later. Dudley's eyes widened with something between awe and sorrow. That day, Harry saw something he hadn't expected in Dudley's eyes, regret, not just for his own behaviour, but perhaps for all the time lost between them. Dudley looked at the children with quiet wonder, and once or twice he looked at Harry the same way, as if seeing him for the first time, not as the freak in the cupboard, but as a father, a man, a human being. Their conversation that day never touched the painful core of their shared history. They didn't mention the cupboard under the stairs or the glass disappearing from the zoo. They didn't talk about dementors or letters flying through chimneys. But they did talk about their children, about school systems and bedtime routines, about how terrifying it could be to raise someone who looked at you with trust and expected you to know what you were doing, and that was enough. From that point on, a slow, infrequent correspondence began. The letters were short, mostly updates. Dudley would write, "Emma broke her arm, but she's fine. Cried more when we told her no swimming for a week." Harry would respond, "James broke a window at school. Claimed it was an accident, but we all know he aimed." Sometimes they'd exchange photographs. Harry sent a picture of the family visiting the burrow. Dudley sent one of Emma in a Halloween costume. She'd chosen to be a dragon. Petunia, according to one brief letter, never quite understood why Dudley kept writing. "Your aunt doesn't like me bringing your name up," Dudley had written. "She says she did what she had to. I don't argue anymore. No point." Harry didn't respond to that part. He didn't know what to say. He often wondered, in quieter moments, what Petunia felt when she saw her son slowly pull away from the prejudices she had carried like heirlooms. There was a Christmas when Dudley sent over a fruitcake wrapped in too much plastic. Ginny had eyed it suspiciously, but Harry had smiled and placed it on the table. The cake tasted awful, but Harry ate it anyway. James declared it a bit tragic, and Ginny whispered, "A bit brave of you eating that." But Harry felt something warm settle inside him, not from the cake, but from the gesture. On one particularly rainy evening, as Harry sat by the fire, he reread Dudley's first letter. It had become worn at the edges, soft with time. He thought about what might have happened if they'd never spoken again, if the past had stayed buried under the rubble of Hogwarts, if Dudley had never reached out. The world would have kept turning, but something essential would have been lost. Harry once told Albus during one of their quiet walks, "Forgiveness doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes it comes with effort." He didn't say more, but Albus, sharp-eyed as ever, seemed to understand. Maybe that was the legacy Harry was building, not a life without pain or memory, but one where scars didn't define the future. Years later, when Emma was invited to a Muggle-born orientation day at Hogwarts, Dudley sent Harry a note. "She's curious about it all," he wrote. "Still not sure how I feel, but I want her to see for herself. Thanks for sending the pamphlet." Harry sent back a simple note. "You're doing better than you think." That summer, Dudley and Emma visited the Potters at Shell Cottage. They walked along the cliffs and ate sandwiches under a cloudy sky. Emma asked if she'd ever be able to ride a broom. James offered her his, but she declined. "I'm not ready," she said. "Maybe next time." Dudley watched her carefully, and when she smiled at something Lily said, he looked at Harry with something that might have been gratitude. Harry often thought about the people who'd shaped him, Dumbledore, Sirius, Lupin. But the Dursleys had shaped him too, in ways he still didn't entirely understand. And Dudley's quiet effort to rebuild something out of that wreckage was perhaps more remarkable than any spell. He never told the children about the worst of the cupboard days. He never told them about the nightmares or the bruises or the cold hunger that sometimes visited him in dreams. But he kept the letter in a box beside his wand, wrapped in old parchment and a bit of red string. Not because it was precious, but because it mattered. There is a kind of magic that comes not from wands, nor from ancient runes or inherited bloodlines, but from the bravery it takes to look backward and still choose to step forward. Dudley's letter was awkward, flawed, and full of silence, but it was also the first stone in a bridge Harry had never imagined he'd walk across. And as years passed, that bridge held, fragile, perhaps, but real.